Welcome back, and tonight, we're stepping into the quiet, close-knit communities of Appalachian small towns. In today's episode, I'll be sharing 8 unnerving true stories centered around one chilling theme: creepy neighbors who were hiding far more than anyone realized. The Appalachian region is known for its dense forests, winding backroads, and towns where everyone seems to know each other. But behind friendly waves and porch lights glowing late into the night, there are whispers of strange behavior, local folklore, and alleged true events that still leave residents unsettled. Some say isolation changes people, others believe certain secrets were never meant to be discovered. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and share it with someone who enjoys real horror stories. Comment below where you're watching from, and let me know if you've ever had a neighbor who made you uneasy. Thank you for being here, and for supporting the channel. I never thought much about old Gerald Hicks until the summer I turned 19 and started noticing the pattern. That was the summer my father finally let me stay home alone when he drove my mother to her sister's place in Tazewell, the summer the heat came in off the ridge like something living and pressed itself against every window of our house until the walls sweated. It was the kind of summer where you do strange things out of boredom and heat sickness, where you stay up too late and sleep too little, and the line between what's real and what your tired mind has invented starts to go soft at the edges. That was the summer I learned that some lines, once crossed, don't ever go back to where they were. Gerald Hicks had been our neighbor my entire life without ever quite feeling like one. His property sat at the far end of our road where the gravel gave out and the tree line started pressing in, a low clapboard house with a tin roof that turned the color of old blood when it rained. He kept to himself the way men from the deep hollows often do, not out of unfriendliness exactly, but out of a habit of solitude so old it had calcified into something else entirely. My father said the Hicks family had been on that land for generations, that they'd come up from one of the drowned communities before the reservoir was built, resettled in a place where no one asked questions because no one expected answers. I accepted that the way you accept everything about the place you grow up in, not with understanding, but with a quiet, unexamined familiarity. The first evening I noticed him, I told myself I was imagining things. It was just after dusk, the kind of dusk that happens fast in the mountains, where the sun drops behind the ridge and the light doesn't fade so much as collapse all at once. I was sitting on the porch with a glass of sweet tea going warm in my hand, watching the fireflies start up in the lower field, when I became aware, the way you sometimes become aware of a sound you've been hearing for a while without registering, that there was a shape at the far edge of the Hicks property. Standing where the mowed grass gave up and the first trees began. Standing completely still. I squinted. The light was bad. I told myself it was a fence post I'd never noticed, a roll of wire standing upright, a trick of the gathering dark. I went inside and didn't think about it again until the following evening, when I came out to sit in the same chair at the same time and looked up without meaning to, and he was there again. Same spot. Same stillness. Same nothing. My father would have said something measured and practical about it, the way he said measured and practical things about everything. He would have said Gerald was an old man who liked to take the evening air at the edge of his property, that there was nothing strange about a man standing on his own land. But my father wasn't there, and in his absence, the thing that felt wrong about it got larger and quieter at the same time, the way dread does when there's no one around to talk you out of it. I started watching for him. I know how that sounds, like I was the strange one, like I had made myself into the problem, but I want to be clear that I was 19 years old and alone in a house at the end of a gravel road in the mountains, and the attention I paid was the attention of someone trying to understand something before it could become something worse. I would come out at dusk and look toward the tree line, and sometimes he was there and sometimes he wasn't, but when he was always in the same place, always facing our house, always still enough that I'd convince myself again that he wasn't real before he'd shift or turn his head and make my stomach drop. What I didn't know, what I was still telling myself didn't matter, was that my little sister Emma had noticed him too. Emma was 11 that summer. She was the kind of kid who collected things: feathers, interesting rocks, the shed skins of black snakes, the paper husks of wasp nests. She had a bedroom that faced the back of the property, and she liked to leave her window cracked at night to listen to the creek, and she told me later, much later, that she'd been watching the figure at the tree line for days before I had. That she'd thought it was exciting. That she'd started leaving small things on the windowsill, a drawing she'd done, a pressed flower, a piece of ribbon, the way children leave offerings for things they're still young enough to believe might be friendly. I only found out about the notes because I found one. I'd gone out to the fence line on the west side of the property to look for a place where the wire was down, where our neighbor's cattle had been getting through, and I found a folded piece of paper tucked under a flat rock near one of the posts. I almost didn't pick it up. It looked like trash, something blown in from the road. But something made me reach for it, some instinct, some low and nameless pull, and when I unfolded it I saw that it was a note. Emma's handwriting on one side, crooked and careful the way her handwriting always was, saying hello, saying she'd seen him and wasn't scared, asking if he lived in the woods. And on the other side, in different handwriting, words pressed so deep into the paper that the fibers had split along the lines of each letter, I see you watching me too. I remember standing very still for a moment. The way an animal stands. I brought the note inside and sat at the kitchen table with it in front of me and made myself look at the handwriting on both sides for a long time. The second handwriting was deliberate. Controlled. Each letter formed with a steadiness that had nothing hurried or casual about it, the handwriting of someone who understood that what they wrote would be read carefully and wanted it to land a particular way. I put the note in my pocket and went to find Emma. She was not frightened when I talked to her about it. That frightened me instead. She said she'd been leaving notes at the fence for 3 days. She said the figure had waved at her once from the tree line, just one slow raise of one hand, and she'd waved back. She said she'd seen him looking up at her bedroom window at night and she hadn't told me because she thought I'd make her close the window and she liked the sound of the creek. I called my father. He called the sheriff. The sheriff drove out the next morning, a man named Tilson who I'd known since I was a child, and he walked the fence line with me and looked at the rock and listened to everything I told him. He wrote things in a small notebook. He said he'd go talk to Gerald Hicks. He came back to where I was standing by his cruiser 20 minutes later with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. He said Gerald Hicks had been in the county hospital in Welch for 2 weeks. A broken hip, a bad one, the kind that kept an old man flat on his back. The nurses confirmed he hadn't left. Couldn't have. Tilson said he'd look into it. He said to keep Emma away from the fence line. He said to call if anything happened. He drove away and I stood in the driveway for a while listening to the gravel settle after his tires, and then I went inside and sat at the kitchen table again and didn't move for a long time. We searched the tree line that afternoon. Tilson had sent a deputy, and my father drove back early and went out himself with the deputy, and I went with them. We walked the whole edge of the Hicks property where the yard met the woods. The grass was tall and tangled in places, a few spots where someone might have stood. One particular area where the grass was pressed down in a way that could have been a deer bed and could have been something else. No footprints we could read clearly. No debris. Nothing left behind. The deputy said it was probably a transient. The mountain had its drifters, men who lived rough in the backcountry and occasionally wandered down close to roads and houses. He said the note was probably opportunistic, just someone messing around, nothing to take too seriously. He said it like he'd talked himself into it, not like he believed it. That night my father sat up in the living room until 4 in the morning. He didn't say that's what he was doing. He said he was just finishing a book. But I heard him moving, heard the creak of his chair, heard the faint sound of the porch door opening once around 2 a.m. and then closing again. I don't know what he saw or didn't see. He never told me. We didn't talk about it as a family, the way mountain families don't talk about certain things, not out of denial but out of a practical understanding that some things don't get better for being spoken about. Emma closed her window. Gerald Hicks came home from the hospital 6 weeks later, and when I saw him from the road, shuffling to his mailbox with a walker, I felt something complicated that I still haven't fully untangled. Relief, maybe. And then almost immediately something else. Because he turned and looked at me when I drove past, the way he always had, squinting in the afternoon light, and I realized I had no idea what he looked like from a distance in the dark. No idea whether the shape I'd been watching at the tree line could have been him or whether it bore any resemblance to him at all. I never found out who it was. Nobody ever came forward, no transient was found, no other neighbors reported anything unusual. Tilson retired 2 years later without ever mentioning it to me again. Emma grew up and moved to Roanoke and says she doesn't remember it the way I do, that she was a kid and kids make things bigger than they are. Maybe she's right. I want to think she's right. But I go back to visit my mother every few months now, and every time, without deciding to, I find myself checking the tree line before I come inside for the night. My hand on the porch light switch, my eyes going to that far edge where the grass gives out and the first dark shapes of the trees begin. Looking for a stillness that doesn't belong. A shape that has no reason to be there. I always tell myself I'm being foolish. I always look anyway. Old habit. A bad one. But the thing about bad habits is that sometimes they're the only thing standing between you and something worse, and you keep them not because you want to but because some part of you, the part that's still 19 and alone at the end of a gravel road, remembers what it felt like to stop paying attention. Nobody moved to Blaine County in March. That was just understood, the kind of local knowledge that doesn't get written down because everyone already knows it. The roads were too soft from the freeze-thaw cycle, half the bridges were weight-restricted until April, and the propane suppliers ran behind all winter and wouldn't catch up until the ground firmed again. You didn't start a new life in this county in March. You waited. Everyone waited. The Pruitt woman did not wait. She arrived on a Tuesday, the second week of March, when there was still a dirty gray crust of old snow along the north-facing slope of our driveway and the creek was running brown and high with snowmelt. I was carrying wood in from the stack when I saw the truck, an older model, dull white, bed loaded with furniture wrapped in moving blankets, make the turn onto our road and stop in front of the old Callaway place. The Callaway house had been empty for 3 years, ever since the family had moved to Beckley to be closer to the hospital for the father's treatments. Nobody had bought it, as far as I knew. Nobody had even looked at it, not seriously. I watched from across the road as a woman got out of the truck. Silver-haired, slight, probably 60-something but moving easily despite the muddy ground. She looked at the house the way people look at something they've already decided about, not the way people look at a new purchase, with hope or anxiety or the complicated mix of both. Just a quiet assessment, like she was confirming what she already knew. She looked over and saw me. She smiled and raised one hand. I raised mine back, out of instinct, and went inside and told my mother we had a new neighbor. My mother, who had lived in Blaine County her whole life and had never met a stranger in any meaningful sense of the phrase, baked a coffee cake the next morning and took it over. She came home glowing the way she did when she met someone she'd decided she liked. She said the woman's name was Mrs. Pruitt, that she was a widow, that she'd come from somewhere in the southern part of the state to be near her late husband's family plot up the road at the old cemetery, and that she was one of the most interesting people my mother had spoken to in years. I nodded and said that was nice and didn't think much more about it. The first pie arrived that Sunday. It was on the porch when my mother opened the door in the morning, set on the top step in a cloth-covered dish, still slightly warm. Blackberry, we found out when my mother lifted the cloth, dark purple and fragrant, the crust crimped in a way that had clearly taken practice. My mother was charmed. She brought it inside and cut it for breakfast and said she couldn't wait to tell Mrs. Pruitt how wonderful it was. I had a slice and it was, objectively, a very good pie. I thought nothing of it. The following Sunday, another pie appeared. Apple this time. The Sunday after that, a butter chess. Then a brown sugar walnut. My mother began to expect them, began to plan her Sunday mornings around them, the way you plan around something that has made itself quietly indispensable. She and Mrs. Pruitt developed a habit of sitting together on our porch in the afternoon, and sometimes I'd come home from town and find them there, talking in low voices like women who'd known each other for decades, and my mother would look up at me with an ease and happiness that I didn't want to examine too closely because examining it would mean acknowledging what I was already starting to feel about the Pruitt woman. Which was this: she was too patient. I don't know how else to describe it. There was nothing overtly wrong with her. She was well-spoken, she was kind to my mother, she answered questions graciously, she remembered small details you'd mentioned in passing. But when she looked at you there was something in her eyes that wasn't quite present, or wasn't quite there for you, the way some people look at you and see something past you or behind you or that you don't know is there. Like she was watching a clock you couldn't see. Waiting for a time you didn't know was coming. I started not eating the pies. I'd take a slice and move it around my plate and dispose of it later, and I felt foolish doing it because I couldn't articulate what I was afraid of, couldn't frame it as anything more than a feeling. My mother would have laughed at me, the neighbors would have said I was being unkind to an old woman who brought us free pies. And they'd have been right, probably. Probably. The thing that changed it for me was the garden. I drove past the Callaway place one afternoon in May and slowed down because something about the garden alongside the house caught my eye. She'd turned the whole south-facing side into a kitchen garden, neatly kept, the soil looking dark and tended. But the plants were wrong. I mean that in a specific way. I grew up in this county, I knew what grew here, I knew what people planted in kitchen gardens and what you found in the woods and what you found in both places. I knew comfrey and yarrow and pennyroyal and pokeweed. I knew what nightshade looked like, what mayapple looked like, what wild ginger looked like. What was growing in that garden I could not name. Some of it resembled things I recognized but was subtly off, the leaf shape slightly wrong, the stem too thick or too thin, the flower a color that didn't match anything in my memory. I went to Delbert Combs. Delbert had farmed this county since before I was born and had a knowledge of what grew in this particular soil and light that I trusted more than any book. I sat across from him at his kitchen table and described the plants as carefully as I could, the shapes, the colors, the way a few of them seemed to grow in a pattern that looked deliberate, a low ring around the perimeter of the garden closest to the road. He listened without interrupting me, his hands flat on the table, his face doing something that made me stop talking before I was finished. He was quiet for a long moment after I stopped. Then he asked how long my mother had been eating the pies. He asked slowly, the way you ask questions when you're hoping the answer will be different from what you're expecting. I told him since March. He asked if she'd been sleeping more than usual. I thought about it and said yes, she had. I'd thought it was just the season changing, just the tiredness that came with the shift into summer. He asked if she'd mentioned strange dreams. I said she'd mentioned something once, something about dreaming of walking in a dark field, about a voice at the edge of the dark. She'd said it like it was pleasant. Like it was a place she'd been looking forward to going back to. Delbert looked at his hands for a moment. Then he told me to go home. He said it quietly and without elaboration and I drove home faster than I should have on those roads, gravel popping under my tires on the curves, the early evening light going yellow and thick over the ridgeline. I was halfway up our road when I started to think about what I was going to say, how I was going to explain it to my mother without sounding unhinged, what I would do if she didn't believe me. I didn't have to explain anything. When I walked into the kitchen my mother was at the table with Mrs. Pruitt and they were both laughing at something, the kind of laughter that sounds like it's been going on for a while and is happy to keep going. My mother's face was open and warm and easy the way it got when she was comfortable and safe. Mrs. Pruitt was pouring coffee from our pot, unhurried, at home, and she looked up when I came through the door. Her expression changed for just a moment. That's what I keep coming back to. Just a half second, maybe less, like a card briefly flipped and then turned back down before you can read it. The patient look, the waiting look, replaced by something else that I can only describe as satisfaction. Like something was proceeding according to a plan that had never needed revision. Then she smiled at me, warmly, and asked if I'd like some coffee. I said no. I said I needed to speak to my mother alone. I watched something flicker in Mrs. Pruitt's face that wasn't a patient expression and wasn't the satisfied one, something older and harder and briefly visible, and then she said of course, naturally, and picked up her things and said her goodbyes to my mother with the ease of someone who had nowhere particular to be because they'd already arranged everything that needed arranging. I watched her walk back across the road. I watched until she was inside and the door was closed. My mother was annoyed with me. She said I'd been rude. She said Mrs. Pruitt was the best neighbor she'd had in years and she didn't know what had gotten into me. I didn't know how to begin to tell her, so I made her tea instead of coffee and I sat with her and I didn't let her out of my sight for the rest of the evening. When she went to bed I sat in the kitchen and looked at the counter where the cloth-covered dish from that morning's pie still sat, and after a while I picked it up and took it outside and buried it at the edge of the property in the dark. I went back to Delbert in the morning. He was less forthcoming than I needed him to be. He told me some things about certain old practices, about the use of particular plants in ways that had nothing to do with cooking, about traditions from the deeper parts of the mountains that had survived in ways most people didn't know and that he himself only half understood. He said some of it was nonsense and some of it wasn't and the problem was telling the difference. He said the safest thing was to ensure my mother didn't eat anything else that came from that woman. I did that. I kept doing it. It wasn't easy. My mother thought I had developed some kind of irrational dislike of a harmless old woman, and I let her think that because it was easier than the truth. The pies kept coming on Sundays. I disposed of each one. After about 6 weeks my mother seemed more like herself, more alert, sleeping more normal hours, no longer mentioning the dreams. In August, Mrs. Pruitt stopped bringing pies. She also, around that same time, stopped coming outside very much at all. By September there were lights on in the Calloway house at strange hours. By October the curtains were drawn. In November my mother mentioned she hadn't seen her neighbor in a while and wondered if she was all right, and I said I was sure she was fine, and changed the subject. In the spring the house was empty. The county had no record of a forwarding address, no record of where she'd gone or when she'd left. The garden had been turned under, all of it, raked flat and packed down, like someone had been very determined to leave nothing behind. My mother still asks about her sometimes, the way you ask about someone you liked who moved away unexpectedly. She says what a lovely woman she was. She says she misses the pies. I don't say anything to that. There are some conversations that only go one direction, and that's not one of the directions I want to go. My brother Cale and I used to joke about it. I want to say that at the front of this because I want you to understand that it started as something we treated as low and ordinary and slightly absurd, the kind of suburban Gothic story you repeat at family dinners with a rueful laugh, the annoying neighbor with the malfunctioning security system, the minor aggravation of interrupted sleep. We joked because joking was available to us and because the alternative wasn't. I stopped joking eventually. Cale took longer. But he stopped too. The Dunmore property shared our east fence line, a tidy split level with a 2-car garage and a long concrete driveway that sloped down to the road, the kind of house that real estate listings called move-in ready. The previous owners had been a retired couple who kept hummingbird feeders and waved at you from the yard. When they sold and moved south, we'd hoped for something similar. What we got was a man named Darren who drove a gray SUV, worked from home as far as we could tell, and had the social presence of someone who had carefully calculated the minimum viable amount of neighborly interaction and committed to never exceeding it. He nodded when we nodded. He raised one hand at the mailbox. He didn't wave. He moved in October. By November we had the floodlights. 4 of them, mounted on the eaves of his garage, aimed to cover the driveway and the east-facing side of his property. High intensity, the kind that blast white light in a way that turns night to daylight in a 50-foot radius and bleeds over into everything adjacent. Our bedroom windows faced east. When they came on, the light came through our curtains and painted the bedroom wall white as a sheet of paper. The first night it happened I looked at the clock. 3 a.m. exactly. The second night, the same. I lay there watching the light seep under the curtains and counted the minutes, and at 7 minutes past 3, it went off. I told Cale about it at breakfast. He laughed and said Darren had probably programmed a security timer wrong, that it happened all the time, that he'd probably realize it in a week and fix it. We agreed it was annoying and made a mental note to mention it if we ever had an actual conversation with the man. 2 weeks later we had timed it on 4 separate nights. Never more than 30 seconds off from 3 a.m. Never more than 30 seconds off from 3:07 for the cutoff. Cale stopped calling it a malfunction. He started calling it Darren's weird thing, and we'd reference it with the kind of affectionate mockery that lets you keep something in the realm of the explainable. Cale's weird thing. Darren's alarm clock. We joked. I got up one night for the bathroom and the light was already bleeding under the curtains and I padded out into the hallway, which had a window facing east, and I looked out. Darren was in the driveway. Standing in the full blaze of those 4 floodlights, positioned roughly in the center of the concrete, facing the road. Not moving. He was in dark clothing, no coat despite the temperature being in the low 30s, and his arms were at his sides, and he was simply standing there the way you stand when every voluntary action has been suspended. Not rigid. Not tense. Just still, the way still can look when it isn't quite the same thing as relaxed. I watched him for the full 7 minutes. He didn't move at any point. He didn't look at his phone, didn't shift his weight, didn't turn his head. He stood and faced the road with the focused vacancy of an animal that has been interrupted in the middle of a thought it has no words for. The lights clicked off at 3:07 and the darkness came back hard and complete and I couldn't see anything for a moment. When my eyes adjusted he was gone. Or I couldn't see him. Both felt the same in that dark. I went back to bed and lay awake until the sky started to lighten. I told myself the rational thing. That he had insomnia, that he went outside at the same time every night because routine was how people managed sleeplessness, that the stillness was a meditation practice, that the lights were on a timer he'd set for himself so he wouldn't have to fumble for a switch. I built the explanation brick by brick and it held right up until it didn't, which was when I remembered his face. The specific nothing of it. The way his eyes had been open and pointed at the road but not, quite, looking at anything visible from where I stood. I decided to knock on his door. I'm still not sure what I intended to say. Ask about the lights, I suppose. Introduce myself properly, maybe. We'd lived next door for months and never gotten past the nod, and feel out whether there was an explanation for the standing that I could absorb and move on from. I went over on a Saturday afternoon. The driveway was empty. I walked up to the porch and got halfway up the steps and stopped. The welcome mat was coir fiber, the standard bristled kind you find in any hardware store. But the coir had been compressed or disturbed in a pattern that was clearly not accidental, pressed down in a deliberate design around the perimeter of the mat, a careful border of markings that I at first thought were letters or numbers and then, looking longer, realized I couldn't identify as anything I recognized. Not language, not symbols I knew, not a brand name worn into the surface. Just a border, precise and even, running the full edge of the mat in a way that would have required real effort to create. Like a threshold. Like a warning at a threshold. I stood on those steps for probably 20 seconds. Then I turned around and walked back down the driveway and across the road to my own house and went inside and stood in the kitchen for a while without turning on a light. I did not knock on Darren's door. I did not mention the mat to Cale because I wasn't sure how to describe what it had made me feel, which was the specific feeling of having almost walked into something that had been, in some way I couldn't articulate, marked. Not locked. Marked. The way you'd mark a trap, or a snare, or an edge you'd identified and didn't want to forget. The lights kept coming on for the rest of that winter and into the spring. Cale eventually stopped mentioning them. I kept timing them out of habit, the way you keep an eye on a thing you've decided not to fully investigate. In May, Darren's SUV was gone for 6 days. When he came back the lights stopped. Just stopped, no explanation, no cycle, nothing. The following week I saw him in his yard doing something ordinary, adjusting a downspout, I think, and he looked up and nodded at me the way he always did. I nodded back. He went back to the downspout. Normal. Mundane. The most ordinary thing in the world. But I didn't walk over to say anything. I thought about the mat. I thought about his face in the floodlights, pointed at the road with eyes that were looking at something I couldn't see from my window. I thought about 7 minutes, the same 7 minutes, night after night, and what you would need to be doing during those 7 minutes that would require a bright light and a marked threshold and perfect stillness. I still don't know. I don't think knowing would have helped me. Some things you're better off holding at arm's length, and I've made my peace with that, mostly. But there are nights now, when I'm up late and the east side of the house gets some moonlight, when I look out of reflex at the Dunmore driveway, checking for a stillness that no longer comes. And I don't know whether what I feel in those moments is relief or something I don't have a clean name for. Probably both. Probably neither. Everyone on Sourwood Lane noticed it eventually. That's the thing about a street like ours, 14 houses, most of them with deep porches, most of the families having lived there long enough to know each other's rhythms and routines the way you know the sound of your own house at night. We noticed things. We talked about them over fences and at the end of driveways. It was the kind of street where someone left a casserole on your porch when you'd had a hard week, and where everyone knew which house left the outside lights on all night and which ones went dark at 9. We were, in that particular way, paying attention. The Yates family arrived in late August. A rental, I found out from my wife, who found out from Patrice at the end of the road, who knew the property management company. Mother, father, 2 children, a girl of about 9 and a boy maybe 11, with a moving truck and a gray minivan, and the temporary, slightly unsettled look of people who had come from somewhere more urban and hadn't fully recalibrated yet. Normal enough. We waved. My wife baked something and brought it over and came back saying they were pleasant, seemed a little tired from the move. The mother had been grateful but brief. Normal. What was not normal was the door. Or rather, the consistent, sustained, 4-month absence of the door. The front door of the Breeden house was a standard residential door, 6-panel, painted the same muted green as the shutters. It had a narrow vertical window on one side, the kind that lets a sliver of light in or out depending on what's happening in the entryway. By the time I started paying attention, those curtains were always drawn, not occasionally, not most of the time, every single time. Every morning when I backed out of my driveway. Every afternoon when I came home. Every evening when I walked the dog around the block. The side entrance off the carport was in constant use. Groceries in and out, school mornings with the kids, late arrivals on weeknights, the carport door opened and closed dozens of times a week with the ordinary rhythm of a family's life. The front door opened 0 times. My wife told me I was being paranoid, which is what she tells me when I'm noticing something she'd prefer I wasn't. I told her it wasn't the door I was really concerned about. She asked me what it was. I said I wasn't sure yet. It was the sound. I want to be precise about this because imprecision will make it easy to dismiss, and I've been dismissed enough on this particular subject that I've gotten careful. It was not voices. It was not music or television, both of which I know the muffled signatures of from years of thin walls and close neighbors. It was not a mechanical sound, not anything I could attribute to appliances or plumbing. It was a low, rhythmic, sustained sound that I became aware of, the first time, on a Wednesday night in October when I was walking the dog past 11 and something made me slow down in front of the Breeden house without quite deciding to. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the dog's leash slack in my hand, and there it was, coming from behind the front door, specifically, not the rest of the house, a sound that was almost a hum and almost not, that sat at a frequency I felt as much as heard, that had a rhythm to it like breathing but not quite the rhythm of breathing. Something just slightly wrong in the timing of it. Something that made the hair on my arms come up before my brain had fully processed what I was hearing. The dog would not move. She stood on the sidewalk with her feet planted and her head lowered and would not take another step toward that side of the street. I gave up on that part of the walk and went home a different way. It happened twice more that week. Different nights, different times, same sound. Same planted feet on my dog. By the third time I had stopped doubting myself, which is a thing that sometimes feels like a victory and sometimes feels like a door opening onto something worse. I asked around. Casually, the way you ask when you don't want to commit to having a theory. Patrice at the end of the road said she'd noticed the family kept unusual hours. Tom, across the street, said the dad had seemed odd when he tried to make conversation once, not rude, just present in a way that felt incomplete, like not all of him was there for the exchange. Nobody else mentioned the door. I didn't bring it up. In January the house was empty. Not gradual, overnight, essentially. Tuesday the minivan was in the carport and Wednesday it was gone, and when I walked over to see, which I did at what I hoped was a discreet hour, the house was clearly vacant. None of the ordinary detritus of a hurried move left behind. Just empty. The county assessed the property in spring for the rental company. I knew the realtor involved, a woman named Sandra who had sold my parents' house, and I ran into her at the gas station a few weeks later and asked, as casually as I could manage, if anything had been unusual about the inspection. She looked at me the way people look at you when they're deciding how much to say. She said the house had been in generally fine condition. Some cosmetic stuff. Nothing structural. She said there was one thing, in the front entryway. She said the floor, the whole floor, wall to wall, had been covered in a thick layer of salt. Not scattered, not incidental, an intentional and thorough layer, like whoever had laid it down had worked their way carefully across the entire space to make sure no square inch was missed. Like they'd wanted to be certain the coverage was complete. Like they'd understood that completeness was the point. She said it like she wanted me to have an explanation for it. I didn't give her one because I didn't have one. I still don't. I've turned it over in my mind many times and I keep landing in the same place, which is this: the salt was on the inside of the front door. Not on the threshold. Not on the step outside. On the inside, laid down in the dark space behind a door that had not opened once in 4 months of a family's ordinary daily life. Keeping something in, or keeping something out. I take the dog on a different route now. She seems to prefer it. Roy Bevins had lived at the end of our road for as long as anyone could remember, which in this part of West Virginia meant something more specific than it would elsewhere. When people said as long as anyone could remember in Alderson County, they meant through fathers and grandfathers and the stories grandfathers told about their own grandfathers. They meant a persistence on a particular piece of land that went so deep into the past it had stopped being measured in generations and had become something more like geology. Roy Bevins was part of the landscape the way the creek was part of the landscape. He kept goats and maintained a kitchen garden and drove a truck so old it had become iconic and did not, as far as anyone knew, own a television. He was not unfriendly. He was not friendly. He simply was, with the particular self-sufficiency of a man who has outlasted every attachment and developed, in that outlasting, something that looks from the outside like contentment. I had never thought much about him beyond the ordinary specifics. He was part of the road the way the road was part of the county. I registered him the way you register the familiar and ordinary, without scrutiny, without curiosity. That changed the summer my uncle came to visit. My uncle Renfield, a name he'd been carrying with mixed feelings his entire life, lived in Knoxville and worked in human resources management for a company I won't name, and he came up to visit for a week in July, the way he did every few years when the distance between family got too apparent to ignore. He was a quiet man, private in the way that people who have been through something difficult sometimes become, private not as a personality trait but as a habit of protection. He did not talk about his work. He did not talk about his past in Knoxville beyond the general and unremarkable. He was good company in the specific and comfortable way of someone who has learned to be present in a room without requiring anything from it. He'd been with us 2 days when Roy Bevins appeared at the gate. Roy did this occasionally, arrived with something from his property, a jar of honey from his hives, a paper bag of summer squash, a bunch of dried herbs that my mother used in cooking without asking too closely about their provenance. He was at the gate with a jar of the amber honey he kept, and my mother went out to receive it, and my uncle happened to be on the porch at the time and went out with her out of sociability. Roy looked at my uncle the way you look at a photograph you're trying to place. Not staring, not impolite, just that quiet focused attention of someone working through a recognition. My uncle offered his hand and Roy shook it, and then Roy said, quietly and without preamble, that he was sorry about what had happened in Knoxville. My uncle's face went the color of old ash. I was watching from the porch and I saw it happen in the space of a breath, the color just dropping out of him, and then he said thank you very quietly and took the honey from Roy and went inside without another word. Roy and my mother talked for a few more minutes about the weather and the garden and he walked back down the road. My mother came in looking puzzled and said she wondered what Roy had meant. I said I didn't know. I watched my uncle sitting at the kitchen table with the honey jar in front of him and not looking at anything. That night, when my mother had gone to bed and the house was quiet, my uncle told me about Knoxville. He told it carefully and in pieces, the way you tell something you've spent years not telling. 7 years before, at his workplace, something had happened, a situation, he called it, involving a colleague and a decision he'd been required to make in a professional capacity, a decision that had resulted in serious consequences for the colleague and that had proceeded without any public record, that had been handled entirely through internal channels and sealed documentation. It had been, he said, the hardest professional thing he'd ever done. It had cost him something he'd never quite recovered. No one knew about it. He'd told no one, not his wife, not his family, not any friend. The HR file was sealed. The colleague had signed a non-disclosure agreement. The only people who knew the specifics were himself, 2 senior administrators at the company, and the colleague in question, who had moved out of state. He wanted to know how a man in Alderson County, West Virginia, a man he had never once encountered in his life, could have said those words to him within 2 days of his arriving. I didn't have an answer. I sat with him for a long time without having an answer, and that sat between us like something solid. I started watching Roy Bevins more carefully after that. Not obviously, not in a way I could have explained if challenged, just the specific attention you develop once something has cracked open the ordinary. I noticed the fence-line conversations. The way he'd stop to talk to people passing on the road and say small, specific things that were quiet enough and private enough that you'd never hear them unless you were close. A woman from 2 roads over stopped at his gate once when I was close enough to see her reaction, the sudden stillness, the hand going to her mouth, and she drove away quickly and didn't wave when she passed me. I asked him once. I thought about it for a long time before I did, and then I did it on a morning when I was walking past and he was out with his goats and it seemed as normal an opportunity as I was likely to get. I said I'd noticed he seemed to know things. I said it plainly and without accusation because I didn't feel accusation was the right tool for whatever this was. He looked at me with the patient expression I'd come to understand was not patience in the ordinary sense but something more like the absence of urgency, the look of someone who exists in a time frame that is slightly longer than the one the rest of us occupy. He said, "The land remembers." I just listen. He said it without drama, without the performance of mysticism. He said it the way you'd explain a simple skill, a practical thing. Fold the dough like this. Watch the weather by the way the clouds sit on the ridge. The land remembers. I said I wasn't sure what that meant. He smiled the smile of a man who knows that some explanations are only available to people who have lived long enough and still enough in a single place, and turned back to his goats. I've told that story to people over the years, and the reaction split roughly in half. Some people want to find the rational explanation, confirmation bias, lucky guesses, the small community gossip network that makes the mountains seem more psychic than they are. I understand that impulse. I've tested it myself, turned the specifics of my uncle's story over and looked for gaps, looked for a path by which some rumor or some piece of known information could have traveled to Roy Bevins through 6 degrees of ordinary human connectivity. I haven't found one. I've looked for 7 years and I haven't found one. Roy Bevins is still there at the end of the road. Still keeps his goats. Still brings honey. I drive past his gate sometimes and he's out in the yard and he raises his hand and I raise mine. Normal. Ordinary. 2 neighbors on a county road doing what neighbors do. But I don't stop and talk to him. I haven't since that morning by the goat pen. I tell myself it's because I don't have questions I want answered that way. I tell myself it's because some information is more useful as absence than as fact. Mostly I think it's because I'm afraid of what he might say. What specific quiet thing he might offer me at the fence line. What I might see in my own face in the silence after. The land remembers. I'd rather not know what it remembers about me. I had lived next door to the Mercer family for 11 months before I saw the boy. I knew he existed. The sounds of him had been part of the texture of my days for nearly a year, the particular creak of a child moving on the other side of a shared wall, footsteps too light for an adult, a muffled voice at moments that made me think of homework, of cartoons, of the ordinary domestic soundtrack of a kid's afternoon. Once, a sound that might have been laughter, quickly followed by quiet. He was real and present and thoroughly contained in that house in the way that some children are when their world has been, by design or circumstance, made very small. I never thought to question it. Children are inside a lot. Some more than others. Some kids are introverted, sedentary, attached to screens and books and indoor things in a way that means you can live beside a family for a year and never once encounter the child in the flesh. I had done exactly that, and it had not troubled me because trouble requires a framework, and I hadn't had one yet. My framework arrived on a Tuesday in late spring. I asked his mother about it casually, as we passed on the driveway one morning. I said something about the neighborhood kids, about the evenings being nice enough for playing outside, the way adults do when they're trying to invite a conversation rather than demand one. She smiled at me with the warm, uncomplicated smile I'd come to associate with her, and she said her son was sensitive to the sun. She said he burned easily, that fair skin ran in her husband's family, that it was simply easier to keep him indoors. She said it without self-consciousness, without any of the defensiveness you might expect from someone who knew it was unusual. Just an explanation, offered freely, then dropped. I accepted it. Fair skin was real, photosensitivity was real, the accommodations parents made for children's particular needs were real. I filed it in the folder of minor neighborhood facts and moved on. The window was different. My bedroom was at the front of my house, and his bedroom, I knew it was his by then, by the sounds, by the single bed scale quality of what I sometimes heard through the wall, faced my driveway. This is not an observation I made immediately or with any intent. It was something that accumulated over many late arrivals home from work, from errands, from evenings at my sister's place across town. Pull into the driveway. Kill the engine. Look up by instinct before getting out, the instinct of someone who lives alone and has learned to do a visual sweep of the accessible parts of their property without consciously deciding to. The light in that window was always on when I pulled in after dark. And there was always a shape at it. Always him. Standing at the glass in a way that was very still for a child, a stillness you don't normally associate with children who are otherwise healthy and present in the world. Not pressing against the glass, not fogging it with his breath, not the ordinary fidgety looking out of a kid watching the neighborhood. Just standing. Positioned at the window like he had been there long before I arrived and would be there after I went in. The second or third time I noticed it, I smiled and raised my hand. Neighborly instinct, the thing you do when you've been seen before you were looking for an audience. He didn't wave back. He raised one hand and placed it flat against the glass. Slowly, deliberately, held it there. A gesture that was its own complete thing, not a wave interrupted and not a greeting I recognized. I went inside quickly. I started parking on the street. I told myself it was for practical reasons that I kept revisiting and finding unconvincing. I parked on the street and went in through the front and tried not to look at the window and usually failed and found him there, still there, the hand against the glass or the hand at his side, always looking out, always somehow expecting me. I mentioned it to a woman at the post office in November, a woman named Flora who had known the Mercers long enough to call the mother by her first name. I mentioned the boy, said I'd seen him at the window, asked whether he was doing better, a vague enough opener that I could adjust based on her response. Flora frowned at me. Not the polite uncertainty frown. The frown of someone trying to reconcile what they're hearing with something they know. She said the Mercer boy had died the previous spring. An accident. She said it gently, The way you say things to someone who has apparently not been informed of a piece of information that has changed the entire shape of the conversation. She said the family had moved to our road not long after, which she had always thought was a strange choice, moving so soon and moving nearby, but that people handled grief in different ways. I thanked her and drove home on the long route. I sat in my car on the street in front of my house for a while before I went in. I didn't look at the window. I want to be clear about that. I made a specific decision not to look at the window, and I sat in the car looking at my own front door instead until the cold made staying out there impractical, and then I got out and I went inside and I cooked dinner and I watched television and I went to bed. I moved at the end of the lease. I didn't tell the landlord why. I gave the ordinary reasons, the ordinary notice, packed the ordinary boxes. The Mercer family was still there when I left. I don't know how long they stayed. I haven't driven down that block since the move. I've had opportunities to, it's not far out of the way, and each time I choose the longer route instead without quite deciding to. I don't know what was at that window. I don't know what was in that house, in the sounds through the shared wall, in the chair being dragged across the floor. I don't know whether grief does things to a house that ordinary people can't account for, whether a family can carry something with them that makes itself at home in the dark of an ordinary bedroom and stands at windows after dark, waiting. I don't know. That's the part that stays with me. Not the hand on the glass. Not the standing. The not knowing, which is its own kind of permanent. The letter was not addressed to us. I want to start there, with that simple fact, because everything that comes after depends on understanding that this was not an error of routing or a confusion about street numbers. This was a letter that arrived in our mailbox, postmarked from a real postmark, addressed in handwriting I did not recognize, and the name on the envelope was a name neither my wife nor I had ever heard in connection with our address or our lives. I set it on the counter the way you set misdelivered mail. The intention was to take it to the post office in the morning. They'd trace the recipient or return it to the sender, a couple of days of minor inconvenience, the kind of small administrative footnote that evaporates from memory inside a week. I went to bed thinking nothing of it. My wife opened it by accident. She said she'd been half asleep in the low kitchen light, that she'd reached for what she thought was a bill, that she'd been 3 lines in before she realized it wasn't what she'd thought it was. She read further because she was awake enough by then to be confused, and confusion carries you forward. She read the whole thing. Then she sat at the kitchen table and waited for me to come downstairs. She slid it across the table without saying anything. I read it standing up. The letter was detailed. It described our house in the specific, accurate way of someone who had been looking at it carefully and from close range over an extended period of time. The cracked step on the back porch, which I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years and which was cracked in a distinctive diagonal pattern. The kitchen window latch, which didn't catch properly and had to be positioned just right or it would drift open in a wind. The pattern of our lights going on and off, which the letter described accurately, bedroom light on at 10, off around 11, kitchen light sometimes still on until past midnight, porch light left on until 2. We don't have a complicated schedule. We're not unusual people. But someone had been watching our house long enough and carefully enough to document our ordinary rhythms and dimensions and architectural details with the thoroughness of a person who had been asked to do this and wanted to do it well. The letter described us. Not by name, not anywhere in the letter were our names used, but in the detailed, observational way that made the anonymity feel more specific, not less. Height and hair color and the car we drove and the approximate time we both left for work. Then it described the house as a prospect. That's the word I keep coming back to, prospect. Not those exact words, but the framing of it, the careful clinical assessment of a property and its occupants that ended with a recommendation. The last line, they don't know yet. Best time is still early spring. My wife and I sat at that kitchen table for a while without talking. I took it to the sheriff the next day. He listened without interrupting me, read the letter himself, put it in an evidence bag, and said he'd look into it. He said it the specific way law enforcement says it when they're not sure what looking into it will mean. I said I understood. I went home. He called 4 days later. He'd traced the postmark, he said. The town name on it was real, it appeared in county records and historical documents and at least 2 local histories of the region. It had been a small community in the eastern part of the state, a hollow settlement that had been relocated and drowned when the reservoir was built in the mid-60s. The post office had closed in 1962. The physical town had been underwater for over 60 years. He said he didn't know what to make of that. I said neither did I. Which was true as a statement but not accurate as a description of my experience, because what I felt was not the neutral blankness of not knowing but something more active and directional, something that pressed on the inside of my chest every time I walked through our kitchen and looked at the window latch that didn't quite catch. We had a security system installed. We fixed the back step. My wife asked if I wanted to move and I said I didn't know, which was true. We stayed. We stayed for another 2 years before we moved for reasons that were real and external and had nothing to do with this, or I tell myself they had nothing to do with this. I still have a photograph of the letter. I took it with my phone before I handed it to the sheriff, some instinct I'm still grateful for. I look at it sometimes, not often, and I read it and notice again the things that I noticed the first time. The handwriting is steady and deliberate, the observations are accurate, the knowledge it demonstrates is too specific to be guesswork. Someone was there, watching our house, counting our lights, measuring our cracked step. Someone was asked to do that or chose to do that, and then wrote it down and mailed it from a town that no longer exists, and somehow it arrived in our mailbox addressed to a name we've never known. Early spring. That's what the letter said. I think about it every February when the light starts to change, when the days start to lengthen and the air begins to come off the mountains with the particular edge of something shifting. I think about it in the way you think about a thing you can't put down and can't fully pick up, a thing that has made itself permanent in the back of your mind not through resolution but through the specific weight of remaining unresolved. The reservoir is 40 minutes from where that house was. I've driven past it twice. It looks like a reservoir. It looks like water and sky and the ordinary stillness of a man-made lake. But I don't stop there, and I don't look too long, and I make sure to be past it before the light gets bad. Nobody had seen Dale Pittman in 11 months when his lights came back on. Not his sister, who lived in town and had keys to his house that she'd stopped using after the first 2 attempts went unanswered. Not his pastor, who had driven out twice and sat in his car in the driveway for 20 minutes each time before leaving. Not the propane man, who said the tank had gone empty sometime in the fall and he tried to reach Dale about filling it and gotten no response and had, eventually, stopped trying. Dale's truck sat in the driveway through the whole of it, autumn, winter, the tentative early spring, collecting pollen and soft tires and the patient silt of leaves, looking less like a vehicle in use and more like a thing that had been left there as a placeholder for the man himself. People assume things, the way people in small mountain communities do when one of their own pulls away from the usual orbits of church and work and neighborly contact. Mental trouble, some said. A woman or the end of one. A debt gone bad. Some men in these mountains eventually just walk in, people would say, meaning they walked into the mountain and the mountain kept them, and while no one thought Dale Pittman was literally living in the woods, the sentiment behind the phrase held, he'd gone somewhere interior that the rest of us couldn't follow, and maybe he'd come back and maybe he wouldn't. The sheriff did a welfare check in the 2nd month. Said there was clearly movement inside, he'd heard it himself, footsteps, the sound of something being moved, but Dale hadn't come to the door and there was no physical evidence of distress, no smell of gas, no sound of distress, no legal basis for forcing entry into a man's house on the grounds that he'd chosen not to come to the door. Which is true, and I understand it, and it still sits uneasily in me when I think about it. I lived 2 houses down. I want to be honest about the fact that I watched his house in a way that probably exceeded what a neighbor could justify to himself. I watched because I couldn't stop watching, because something about what was happening 2 houses down had gotten under my attention and wouldn't let go. I told myself it was concern. It was also something else, something closer to the drawn, compelled watching you do at the sight of an accident, not because you want to see harm but because some part of your brain has registered that this is a threshold event and is insisting you witness it. The lights were what I watched. Not random. Never random, I established that early and continued to confirm it over weeks. The lights in Dale's house moved in patterns, on and off in sequences that repeated over days. Not the same sequence every day, but a set of sequences that recurred over a cycle of maybe a week or 10 days, like a vocabulary of signals being rehearsed or maintained. I took notes. I have the notebook still, dates, times, which lights in which rooms, the duration of each. I don't know what I thought I would do with that information. I didn't do anything with it. But I kept the notebook. The November incident was the only time I saw Dale directly during those 11 months. It was very late, past 2 in the morning, and I was up because I wasn't sleeping well that fall, and I heard his back door open. Not footsteps before it, not the ordinary sounds of someone moving through a house toward a door, just the door opening, like whatever was in that house had waited in the dark immediately behind it until the moment to open it arrived. I went to my window. Dale was in his backyard, standing on the gravel near the fire pit he'd built years ago, and he was looking up. Not at anything specific that I could see, not a plane, not the moon, the sky was overcast that night. Just up, with his face tilted back and his arms at his sides and his body with the quality of absolute stillness that I had, by that point, learned to recognize as different from ordinary standing. Different from rest. Different from thought. He stood there for over an hour. I watched for a while and then I went and sat on my bed and listened, and after a while I heard the gravel shift and the back door open and close, and the house was quiet again. I sat for a long time after that. When the lights came back on permanently in the 12th month, it was on an ordinary Thursday, no ceremony, no announcement. They were just on in the evening the way lights are on in an inhabited house, and the following morning Dale's truck was running warm in the driveway, and then it was in town and then it was back again. His sister went over. She called me afterward, because she knew I'd been watching, and she said he seemed fine. A little thin. Quieter than usual. But fine. I saw him at the hardware store about a week later. He recognized me, greeted me by name, asked about my family. He seemed, by every ordinary measure, like Dale Pittman. Same voice. Same general manner. Same face. His eyes were different. I don't know how else to say this without it sounding like the kind of thing people say to be dramatic about an experience that doesn't require drama. His eyes were different. Not the color, not the shape, something about what was behind them. Dale had always had eyes with a particular quality of presence, warm and direct, and specifically the eyes of a man who was entirely located in himself. What I was looking at in that hardware store aisle had eyes that were present and attentive and focused and inhabited by something that was doing a very good job of being Dale Pittman. I finished the conversation quickly. I said it was good to see him. He said the same. I went to the other end of the store and stayed there until I heard him leave. I've seen him many times since. He lives normally, as far as I can tell. He rejoined the church, visits his sister, attends the kind of local events that a man like Dale would attend. By every outward measure, he came back from wherever he'd been and resumed his life without seam or disruption. But I don't go to his end of the road. Not since the hardware store. I route around it, take the extra mile, and when people ask why I've stopped taking the shortcut I make up something about the road surface, about the loose gravel on the curve, about nothing. I keep thinking about that hour in his backyard. The face turned up to an overcast sky. The arms at the sides. The complete and total stillness of someone who has stopped needing to move because they have arrived, finally, at exactly where they are supposed to be. I don't know what came back from that house. I know it smiles the right way and says the right things and goes to the right places. I know that from the outside it is indistinguishable from the man I used to wave at from my driveway, the man whose lights I watched for 11 months in a notebook I still have. I know that's not enough. I've known it since the hardware store. And I know that knowing it doesn't give me anything to do with it, nowhere to take it, no authority to lay it before. Just the knowing, sitting in the back of everything, quiet and permanent, the way a stone sits in a current, unmoved by the water, unchanged by the years, exactly where it landed.